I am Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hale, 42 years old, and for most of my career, I served as the lead systems engineer for some of the most sensitive defense projects in the country. I never imagined that the room where I spent half my life briefing generals and analysts would one day feel colder than a battlefield. That morning inside the Pentagon, the air felt pressed against my ribs as if it already knew what was coming. I stood at the head of the long polished table facing officers who once trusted every calculation I made, and I walked them through the final sequence of a system that took me almost 2 decades to perfect. Atlas Defense was supposed to be the safeguard that closed every gap our units had bled through a living shield, built from thousands of field failures and lessons carved into bone. Yet the only eyes I could feel were the sharp ones of Captain Luke Bennett, watching me like he was waiting for a mistake I had not made. I remembered mentoring him when he was still a cadet, with big ambitions and a louder ego. A kid who thought lineage mattered more than discipline. Now he sat at the far end of the table, shoulders squared, fingers folded, studying me with a calmness that did not belong to someone who believed in the mission. It was the calmness of someone who believed he already owned the room. I clicked on the final projection, the one showing the adaptive response cycle that made Atlas different from anything we had deployed before, but the tension along my spine told me the technology was not what anyone here was focused on. Something in the room shifted when the lights dimmed, a brief hush that felt less like respect and more like anticipation. The kind that crawls over your skin before an ambush. I kept speaking because that was what discipline required. But inside I felt a growing chill as I sensed faces turning neutral in ways I had never seen. These were people who once fought beside me in late-night war rooms, people I believed would never forget the weight of what we were building. Now they studied the table, the screen, anything but me. I finished the final line of my briefing with a voice steadier than I felt, and for a moment the room stayed silent, heavy and unmoved. In that pause, I understood that I was standing alone, surrounded by uniforms that no longer felt like allies. And beneath all of it, almost hidden, was the faint scent of betrayal settling into the air. The slide hadn't even faded when the projector cut to black. No warning, no flicker, just gone. The Pentagon seal replaced my final diagram if someone had been waiting for this exact second. I reached for the remote again, thinking it was a glitch, but my badge light flashed red. System locked. A hollow click echoed in my chest. Across the table, Captain Bennett stood slowly with a poise that screamed rehearsal. "Thank you, Colonel Hale. That will be all." His voice was calm, loud enough to carry and completely detached from the weight of what he'd just done. The room didn't move. No one asked a question, not even General Stanton, who had once sworn he'd back Atlas to the end. I stood there with my hand still hovering over the remote, like an idiot who hadn't read the room in time. Bennett's tone turned colder as he continued announcing that Atlas Defense would now be led by a new internal task force under his direct command. He didn't look at me. Not once. Not even when he said my name. He used it like it belonged to someone who was already gone. My mouth was dry, and I tried to speak, but I couldn't find words that wouldn't come out as a shout. I looked around hoping to find at least one face still with me. Major Hendricks, who spent 2 years in the desert debugging the prototype. Captain Silver, who once stayed up 3 nights straight with me rewriting line after line of the adaptive code. Nothing. Their eyes dropped to the table, their backs too straight, like soldiers trying to disappear in plain sight. I'd known betrayal in theory. I'd read enough history, been briefed on enough operations where things turned fast, but I never thought I'd see it unfold in slow motion with silence sharper than any bullet. The kind of silence that makes you doubt your own heartbeat. Bennett walked toward the screen like he owned it, like he hadn't just gutted a man in front of his own people. His team entered without knocking. Civilians in suits. Probably contractors. They moved with quiet precision, pulling files, switching out hard drives, securing access points. I could feel the air shift again, colder now. Not like tension, like aftermath. One of them slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside was a formal transfer order, not a dismissal. That would have at least felt honest. This was labeled as a reassignment effective immediately. Signature line blank. I didn't sign it. I didn't even touch the paper. I stood there, not as an officer, not as the man who designed the damn system they were now taking, but as someone who no longer existed in that space. I caught a glimpse of Silva again. She blinked hard and looked away, jaw clenched like she was trying to swallow the truth. I didn't blame her. I blamed what they'd made her do. My name was still on the design patent, on the initial test logs, on every brief sent to Central Command. But that didn't matter. The screens were already being reset. My credentials were being stripped in real time. You could feel it, like watching your name burn while your hands were tied. I turned to General Stanton, needing him to say something, anything. He cleared his throat and said the decision was made at the highest level. Said it wasn't personal. I nearly laughed, because betrayal rarely feels personal when it's dressed in protocol and stamped with clearance codes. I gathered the last of my notes, even though I knew they'd already been copied, flagged, and dissected. There wasn't even a thank you. Not from the officers, not from the tech staff, not from the brass. Just the quiet hum of a room shifting its loyalty to the next man in line. As I stepped back from the table, Bennett nodded like we had just wrapped up some routine briefing. His smile was too clean, too rehearsed. The kind that gets practiced in the mirror before a takeover. I didn't give him the dignity of a response. When I left the room, I didn't head straight to the exit. I walked the long hallway past the Atlas server lab, the place where every breakthrough came after sleepless nights and near burns. I stopped at the glass panel, hand resting on the locked door. Everything still looked untouched, but I knew better. I knew the erasure had already begun. I felt it in the way the walls didn't welcome me anymore, in how the lights flickered a half-second too long before turning on. Like the building itself had decided I no longer belonged. I didn't say goodbye, didn't nod to anyone. I walked out knowing that my legacy had been stolen mid-sentence. But what they didn't know was that I'd left something behind, something they hadn't seen, something they couldn't erase. Not yet. The Nevada compound looked like a relic from another era. Dry wind swept over the sand as I keyed in the override sequence at the gate. No digital scan, no remote access. Just hardwired security that hadn't been updated since the day I left. That was the point. No one could tamper with what they couldn't reach. Inside, the air was thick with dust and silence. I walked the corridor past rows of darkened terminals and server racks. Everything powered down but not forgotten. Room 12B still had my name on it. I unlocked the door with a magnetic key that only 2 people ever had. One of them was me. The other was gone. The safe was behind the ventilation panel. 14 digits, 1 biometric swipe, and a physical lock turned with a click that echoed louder than expected. Inside was the original charter contract signed in ink by General Arnold Dempsey. Page 47. Bottom right corner. Clause 14.2. Legacy reversion. Most people missed it. Legal teams skimmed past it because it wasn't bolded, flagged, or indexed. But Dempsey and I designed it that way on purpose. Clause 14.2 was a hybrid failsafe. One half lived in the document. The other lived deep inside the Atlas framework, buried below diagnostics, hidden inside a line of what looked like a deprecated watchdog function. The contract half was simple on paper. If Atlas were ever transferred, seized, or modified without federal verification and signatory alignment from the original architect, the system would default ownership back to the founding authority. What they didn't know was that the technical half was far more aggressive. I'd spent 6 months embedding a passive loop through Atlas's neural core, Every 72 hours, it swept the digital ledger validating signatures against the Pentagon registry. Any discrepancy triggered a silent countdown. After 24 hours, the reversion protocol was activated. Not just a lockout, a rewrite. Full access revoked. Ownership reassigned. Control rerouted. They couldn't see it because I never labeled it. The reversion wasn't just hidden. It was scattered. Fragmented into subroutines that looked like debugging clutter. Masked behind legacy code from older builds that no one bothered to clean up. Because no one thought I'd build something that could fight back. But I did. 3 years before I was pushed out, I had already seen the shift. The whispers of commercialization. The push for private defense partnerships. I knew someone would try to own what they didn't earn. So I wrote the protocol in silence. Layered encryption with rotating hash keys and a secondary core that only responded to my terminal. Even if they copied the system, even if they scrubbed my name from the patent, they couldn't scrub the code. Because it didn't need my name to know who built it. It just needed the truth. And I'd fed it the truth line by line, parameter by parameter, until it could defend itself without asking permission. I powered up the console. A soft hum returned to the room as servers flickered to life. I watched the monitor scroll through boot logs, every line a quiet reminder that I had never stopped protecting what mattered. I typed a command manually. Run legacy. Reversion. Validate. The screen paused, then responded. Root clause verified. Legacy authority pending, awaiting field activation. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment. They thought I was out of moves, but all I had done was let them make the first one. The rest was already in motion. The Dawn protocol was never meant to be dramatic. No sirens, no warnings. Just a quiet, irreversible shift back to the truth. I sat at the terminal, the air in the server room, barely moving, and placed my palm on the biometric pad. The scanner warmed under my skin, pulling a triple verification matrix through subdermal patterns, pulse pressure, and thermal echo. It blinked once, then accepted. Next came the vocal passphrase. A phrase buried so deep in memory I hadn't said it out loud in years. I spoke it with clarity, not force. The system recognized the cadence, the pauses, the imperfections. Real voice, real person. The AI validated the audio chain, then cross-checked against the original encryption pattern stored in the isolated core. Dawn protocol initiated. Lines of white text streamed down the screen, each one a trigger point. The system began crawling the ownership logs of Atlas Defense. Not the ones displayed in press releases or shallow dashboards. These were the root logs. Time-stamped, federal sealed. Immutable unless tampered with. And they had been. The moment the system found a mismatch between the official transfer record and the federal digital ledger, it stopped. Not paused. Stopped. Every permission issued after the breach was flagged. The AI began unraveling every thread tied to unauthorized access. Not just who changed what, but when, from where, and with what authority. They thought they could fake a chain of custody, that their paperwork shuffle would hide the theft. But the system was designed to recognize deception in structure, not intention. It didn't care about motive, only the chain. And once that broke, everything downstream became invalid. I watched it work calm, not because I didn't feel anything, but because I'd already felt it all before. The betrayal, the loss, the silence of those who should have stood up. But I never built Dawn for revenge. I built it because systems built on trust need safeguards when trust collapses. Resetting Atlas wasn't sabotage. It was a correction. Every file, every credential, every line of access was rolling back to day one. Not frozen, rewritten, cleared of anything that didn't align with the integrity of its creation. Not to prove a point, to prevent damage, to keep power out of the hands that hadn't earned it. My face stayed blank, but my spine tightened when the line appeared: Dawn reversion active. Legal chain void. Reassignment in progress. This wasn't a stunt. It wasn't about pride. It was about making sure that Atlas, a system meant to protect, couldn't be twisted into something that served profit ambition or legacy politics. It had to stand alone, untouchable, accountable, only to the principles it was born from. They would never understand that. They'd see it as sabotage, as spite. But in time, when the noise faded and the dust settled, they'd realize what it really was. A reset, a return to something cleaner. I leaned back, watching the final sequence begin. The cursor blinked, awaiting confirmation. I didn't hesitate. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I refused to let what I built become something it was never meant to be. I typed one line. Then I pressed enter. Captain Bennett stood behind the podium, polished and sure-flanked by flags and lined with medals. He smiled at the cameras like he'd already won, voice steady as he declared that Atlas defense now belonged to the next era. His hand moved toward the biometric scanner, rehearsed and slow like a general sealing history with a signature. I watched from a small room across the state, coffee and handlight, slanting through half-open blinds. The screen showed every angle. Red carpet, flashing lights, rows of reporters. The scanner blinked once, then again, then stopped. A second passed. The screen behind him flickered. Static, a pause, then black. A beat broke through the silence. Then 3 words. Unauthorized input detected. The room didn't erupt. It cracked. A slow unraveling of certainty. The tech officer next to him leaned in, whispering something sharp. Bennett's face dropped half an inch. He glanced sideways, barely moving his mouth, and tried again. The machine didn't budge. Behind him, the Atlas logo dimmed, replaced by a rotating red symbol. Ownership mismatch detected. Legal reversal initiated. Reporters began to murmur. One raised a phone. A woman in a blazer near the back mouthed a question. No one answered. The camera crew held their position, confused, whether to keep filming or cut the feed. Bennett shifted. His jaw clenched. He leaned into the mic and forced a smile. We are experiencing minor technical issues. The screen cut him off. System override in progress. My monitor showed the live feed just a few seconds ahead. I didn't move. Just sipped the last of the lukewarm coffee and let the weight of the moment settle. This wasn't a theater. This was the system doing what it was built to do. No sound effects. No countdown. Just the truth reclaiming its place. On the podium, Bennett tried to hold his posture. His hand still hovered near the scanner, like proximity could change reality. The lights above him began to flicker. Security staff looked at each other, waiting for a cue that never came. A man in the front row stood up, slowly backed away. The tech team behind the scenes scrambled. Fingers moved fast on touchscreens, eyes darting between servers and code. But it was too late. Across every screen, one message echoed in sequence. Ownership chain invalid. Access revoked. Reverting to legacy authorization. The cameras caught it all. The slip in Bennett's voice. The sweat along his temple. The brief, sharp breath he took when he realized the thing he claimed wasn't his. Not legally. Not technically. Not in spirit. He'd rehearsed a victory speech, but the system delivered a verdict. And I didn't need to say a word. That was always the point. I didn't build Atlas to fight back with anger. I built it to remember who gave it purpose, who stayed up rewriting lines of code through deployments and missed birthdays. The truth wasn't loud. It was precise. Back at the broadcast, the sound cut out. Cameras shook. The screen behind Bennett now read one line in white over red. Legacy protocol active. The room finally reacted. Someone shouted. Another tried to unplug a terminal. The feed went black. I stood there for a while, staring at the blank screen, letting the silence fill in everything that didn't need to be said. Then I turned off the monitor and walked outside. Sunlight had just started breaking over the rooftops, cold but clean, just like I planned. The calls started within the hour. Media outlets, tech blogs, defense contractors. Everyone wanted a quote, a reaction, a face to match the system that just pulled the rug out on live television. I didn't answer any of them. I turned my phone over and left it vibrating against the kitchen counter. Bennett called next. Not through official channels, but from a private number I hadn't seen since we served together. I let it ring 3 times before picking up. His voice was clipped, maybe forced calm, just shock. He asked what I did. I told him the clause, executed as written. There was a pause. I imagined him standing in some sealed conference room, flanked by lawyers who were already trying to rewrite what just happened. He said they didn't know the clause was still active. I didn't respond. He asked if we could agree, fold the protocol back into their hands, renegotiate the terms. I told him the system wasn't built for negotiation. It was built to hold ground when people forgot where it came from. There was no hatred in my voice, no fire, just a line he couldn't cross. He started to say something else, but I hung up. He didn't call back. They tried again later. Not Bennett. Someone higher. Federal liaison probably sent to clean up. They offered compensation, framing it like a misunderstanding that could be patched up with the right contract. I let them talk. Then I told them one thing. This wasn't about punishment. It was about protection. They didn't get it. Most never do. They think justice has to be loud, explosive, flashy. But real protection is quiet. It just works. It waits until it has to move. And when it does, it doesn't ask for permission. That night, I sat on my balcony with the lights off watching the skyline shift. No glow from the Atlas Tower. No banner. Just a blank glass facade. The way it should be. I didn't smile. I didn't toast. I just let the moment pass through me. Not triumph. Not relief. Just the stillness that comes when something broken resets itself. They'll spin it. Say it was a glitch, a protocol error. But the system knew the truth. It didn't lash out. It didn't destroy. It reclaimed. That's all it ever needed to do. 1 year later, the building was quiet but alive. Hale Defense Initiative wasn't flashy. No glass towers or buzzwords, just clean lines, sharp minds, and machines that did what they were told. I walked through the main floor that morning, coffee in hand, sunlight cutting through tall windows. On the far wall hung the only thing I framed. Not a medal. Not a photo. Just a clean plaque etched in brushed steel. The Dawn Protocol. Inventor M. Hale. No logos. No footnotes. Just the truth. The place smelled like fresh paint and solder. Real work is happening. Nothing staged for a camera. Across the hall, my lead systems engineer had fallen asleep on his desk again. I smiled, tapped the doorframe, and kept walking. We weren't building for fame. We were building because the world needed systems that could hold when others broke. Not for revenge. Not for legacy. For clarity. For defense that couldn't be hijacked by greed or fear. My office was smaller than people expected. Just a desk, 2 chairs, a terminal, and a window that faced east. I liked watching the light hit first thing in the morning. Reminded me why we kept going. That afternoon, Liam, my right hand from the early days, leaned against the doorway. Hair a mess, coffee in hand. He looked around, then nodded toward the plaque. He asked if I ever regretted how it ended. I didn't even pause. Justice doesn't need applause. It just needs light. He smiled. Warped off, I stayed where I was for a while, watching the sun slip past the glass. The room was still not silent. You could hear the hum of servers, the quiet rhythm of something built right. Legacy isn't what you claim, it's what you protect. And this time we weren't giving it away.